Hi, this is Mike Seagraves with No Ceiling Real Estate, and today we're going to talk about earnest money. So what is earnest money in a real estate transaction? It is good faith money. It is money that a buyer puts up in a trust account with the real estate brokerage or whatever the terms are that the buyer and the seller agreed to. And the seller, on the other hand, takes that as good faith money. It's the buyer's goodwill to give some sort of money. And in return, the seller takes the house off the market and begins to work as a collaborative effort to sell the piece of property. So earnest money has changed over the years. It used to be that it was kind of a known, unrequired requirement, if you will. We're seeing a lot of real estate transactions happening now where there's no earnest money. There's a lot of interesting fallacies that exist with how it needs to be handled. At the end of the day, it's whatever the buyer and the seller agree to do with earnest money. If they decide to bury it in the ground in a tin can behind the tree, and if they put that in the contract, then that's what needs to happen. So, what does it mean for the seller to have earnest money? At that point, it's really nothing more. The money is nothing the seller gets. They're not entitled to it unless it's written as such in the contract. And, it's really the seller looking at it as, hey, I'm entered into an agreement with this buyer who in good faith is putting up earnest money. He's put up earnest money and putting forth his goodwill to close the transaction. So then next, what does that mean to the buyer? So that to the buyer, that's the buyer's way of saying, I am committed to this transaction and I'm willing to work forward with you in an effort to close the transaction whereby the buyer purchases the property. So the problem I have with earnest money is kind of leads me to the next direction, which is the real estate agent. The real estate agent has no opinion whatsoever in a transaction. A lot of times real estate transactions can get a little heated, and when they do, the real estate agent is kind of prone to falling in a position of saying, I think my buyer needs to get the earnest money, or my seller needs to get the earnest money. The agent has no dog in that fight. It really is between the buyer and the seller, and there's only a couple ways that earnest money can be released from a trust account at a real estate brokerage, and the state of Ohio defines that. And one of those is not a realtor having their opinion. So to my realtor friends out there, keep your opinion out of the earnest money. It's between the buyer and the seller. So who gets the earnest money? So first off, the parties have to agree mutually to release the earnest money. So if something happens in the transaction and the buyer requests the earnest money to be returned back to them, then the seller would have to sign that document saying, I agree to return the money back to you. Or they could mutually agree to give the money to the seller. Maybe there's something that's happened in the transaction where the buyer feels bad and says, you know what, I entered in good faith, but something happened in my life that I really feel the seller deserves the money. I've also seen it mutually agreed upon where they do something in the middle. Maybe they split it. Maybe they take the $1,000 of earnest money and they divide it amongst the two parties. But again, that is between the buyer and the seller. Another reason that earnest money would be released from the trust account would be if the magistrate or the court makes a decision on the earnest money. So in this instance, the parties, most likely the buyer has taken the seller to court to plead their case as to they deserve the earnest money. And, we encourage earnest money to be less than $3,000 if we can help it, because $3,000 currently will put you in small claims court, and it's easier to have your case heard between a buyer and a seller in small claims court than to make it above $3,000. And once you get to that threshold, you go to common pleas, and most likely they're going to have to hire an attorney. So that then can get expensive. The last reason that earnest money would be released is, let's say the deal went sideways, the buyer and the seller disagree with each other. The buyer asks for the earnest money, the seller says you're not getting it. The seller asks for the earnest money, the buyer says you're not getting it. What happens to the money at that point? Well, the law states that after 24 months, the real estate brokerage or whoever is holding the trust account money is to immediately return the funds back to the buyer, but only after 24 months. In a rare instance where we can't find the buyer after 24 months, we are then required to submit it to the unclaimed funds department for the state. So with that being done, if you have any questions about earnest money, please let me know. Take care.